All right, so I'm gonna put you in a sticky position, if I haven't already. All right, so your co-host John McWhorter, I saw him speak at the Dissident Dialogues a couple of months ago, and I enjoyed his book Woke Racism. I'm pretty familiar with his ideas. I was really disappointed to see the position that he took on student protesters for Palestine. And at the conference, I found that the so-called intellectual dark web thinkers generally suddenly forgot all of their appreciation of these Western traditions of open inquiry and debate as soon as Israel became the subject. Suddenly there was an Israel exception to everything they had been saying for years. So McWhorter at one point, they asked him if he thought woke was ending. And he said, this is right when the Columbia protests were going on. And he said, well, I would have thought so until 2 weeks ago. And I found that so horribly disingenuous to just throw this woke label onto political protest as if there could be no other reason, as if they could have no legitimate humanitarian concern for the horrors coming out of that region, whatever your opinion of it, even if you're on the other side of it, to dismiss it as woke. It seemed to me, and he was certainly not the only one at that festival, it was pretty universal. Everyone, most of whom had been these advocates for the Western tradition of freedom of speech, had nothing but contempt and derision for these students. What is your opinion of these student protests? And why do you think so many who extolled the virtues of Western civilization and the tradition of the debate until October 7th suddenly found an exception on October 8th?
Yeah, you're right. You do put me on the spot, both with respect to commenting on my nearly 20-year partner in conversation, John McWhorter, and with respect to speaking in public about the conflict in the Middle East, period, full stop.
I mean, we could turn the heat up even more. We could ask Luan to go first. Hey, what do you think? And then toss to you. Make this really interesting.
Well, we'll get to Luan.
We'll get to all right. Luan,
all right. I don't want to preempt anything because I agree that would be interesting, and it's going to get interesting before it's over. I think two things. I think, how many babies are you going to bury under rubbles of collapsed buildings with multi-thousand-ton bombs falling on people who basically can't fight back? You're shooting fish in a barrel, I think. I can comment on that. You can't tell me I can't notice that. You can't ask me to unsee the photographs that I'm seeing. You can't ask me to unhear the reports that I'm hearing. That's not anti-Semitism. That's not anti-Zionism. That's humanity expressing itself. Don't ask me to not notice that. I think that. I think the protests have their warts and all. They have their excesses. They have their stuff that I'm not going to try to defend. Of people, and of course there's anti-Semitism. I agree that there's anti-Semitism. On the other hand, I'm so proud of these kids, I could burst. By the way, at Brown, half these kids are Jews. The kids that got arrested occupying the president's office, half of them were Jewish. Some of my Jewish students are amongst the leading protagonist in expressing outrage at what's going on. So I think that. The other thing I think is the irony is exquisite. This is apropos to the dark web stuff and to John and woke racism, for example, because the identitarian factor driving the pro-Zionist advocacy is like stupefying. These people are taking identity politics to another level altogether. You're going to tell me that my Jewish friend who has never set foot outside of New Jersey, but who dreams of immigrating to Israel and establishing a life in a Jewish country, isn't it identitarian?
Right.
Well, of course.
And the irony is that they take the DEI, John is a champion of this, the critique of DEI, and they flip it. So they say things like settler colonialism, which they think is a discrediting reference because it's a reference to a DEI idea, which if you're against DEI, you're going to be against settler colonialism. So you're going to be against the people who criticize Zionism from that point of view. And therefore, we can tarnish your position against Zionism by associating it with a DEI thing. And I, for the reasons I've already stated, find that to be extremely ironic. Since you're the master of DEI-ism, the presidents of the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard are gone because of your use of DEI tactics. And the other ones are hanging on by their fingernails and looking over their shoulder, afraid that you're going to come and get them next because of your use of DEI tactics. So DEI is bad until it's not bad.
That's I love that answer generally. I'd like to press you a little bit on the anti-Semitism point, but I would like to bring Luan in first. So what do you think about the student protests?
I'm also proud and supportive of the student protests. I wanted them to continue. I know the school's out. There are protests here and there. You've got Code Pink, who is still actively protesting. You've got other Jewish Voice for Peace, who is also protesting as well. I'm very much in support of it, and I want to see more. I feel helpless at seeing the inhumanity of what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. And yes, Noam Chomsky called it settler colonialism, if I'm not mistaken. I'm supportive of how my husband responds to it. I know it's difficult for him because of his associations and colleagues. I want him to say how he feels, and it's devastating for me to see every day what's occurring to the Palestinians, and I don't know what I can do. I want to do something. I donate, but I just feel like I'm the typical American who is just sitting here voicing her outrage on screen, and there's nothing I can do that's going to really impact. That's going to cause some type of impact.
I think a lot of us are feeling that way as this drags on. Why is there this exception for Israel? Why did all these principles go out the window as soon as Israel became the subject? What is this deep connection that these people who are mostly not Jewish themselves have to the idea that there must be in my opinion, by definition, racist state? If you're calling it a Jewish state, that you can't have a certain number of non-Jewish people living in, because then it won't be a Jewish state. It's by definition a race-based state. Why are all these people lined up to defend this proposition and anything that it does in violation of every principle they were espousing on October 6th? Why did all that go out the window? I don't understand it. Why Israel? Why? Glenn, you want to weigh in on that? Glenn's like,
yeah, I mean, there are a number of things that you can say.
Well, that's 45 minutes. I think we made a lot of progress this week. We'll see you guys back next week. Chew on that. Take some of that home, and we'll see you next week.
This is a difficult subject. I told this story at my newsletter, glennloury.substack, that my wife and I were invited to a synagogue in West Palm Beach, Florida. Palm Beach Synagogue, very prominent synagogue in Southern Florida, by friends. I'm friendly with the guy who is the chairman of the committee inviting speakers. And, I have the podcast. A lot of people follow me at the podcast who are, Jewish and, admire the work that I'm doing at the podcast as a conservative critic of American political culture. So I got invited to the synagogue to speak about Black-Jewish relations. The invitation came before October 7th, 2023, but the event was in, I think, January of 2024. So the war was in process. And I had a pet speech about Black-Jewish relations that I was prepared to deliver based on essays that I've written going all the way back to the 1980s and 90s that I could update, talk about affirmative action and stuff like that, But I didn't really have anything prepared to say about the conflict. And my wife was sitting in the front row as a guest of honor at the synagogue, and it was full of people. And a very distinguished, the rabbi and the founder of the program, the guy who was the benefactor and all that. And they introduced me glowingly beforehand and whatnot. And the question that I ought to have been addressing myself to, what about this war and Israel? I had, by the way, publicly called for a ceasefire within weeks of October 7th. I'd said in effect, Israel has to respond. Of course, it has to respond, but let's try to keep that within certain bounds of, human decency and so forth. And, whatever. The event came.
I called for a ceasefire immediately because I knew that was not going to happen. They could not be trusted, but that's okay. Go ahead.
I spoke, and I did not say anything about Gaza in the course of my speech.
Yep.
We went to dinner at the home of the benefactor after the speech. And nothing was said about Gaza during the entire dinner conversation. I'm looking at my wife out of the corner of my eye saying, oh my God, am I going to be able to live with this woman after the fact? Is she going to say, as Cornel West would say, you went down there with those big, important, and influential Jewish people, and you didn't have a mumbling word to say about the persecution of our poor Palestinian brothers and sisters? To which the answer is yes, I did exactly that. And I'm actually not proud of it. So after a couple of months of sitting with that and having to talk over the dinner table with my lovely wife about these matters, I decided that I needed to address it at the newsletter. And so I drafted basically a statement in which I said pretty much what I've said here about the conflict, and in which I also said, I didn't feel free to say what I really thought. And that's a problem. Problem not just for me, it's a problem for all of us. And so while I'm not answering the question was, why does Israel and Zionism get an exception from the judgments that might otherwise be brought to bear on identitarian, and you could call them racist, they're ultra nationalist kinds of ideas, which are now put in motion at the expense of hundreds of thousands of people? Why is there so little said about that? Why is there not a mumbling word to be heard from people who are otherwise staunch defenders of liberal ideals? I mean, you listen to people like John Mearsheimer. Is Israel really a liberal democracy? Well, no, it's an ethno-state, you would be inclined to say, based upon the historical evidence at hand. And why is nobody saying that from the rooftops at this moment? I don't know the answer to the question. I'm merely sharpening the question itself.
I mean, it may be Upton, from what you're describing about the enormous pressure there is not to speak on it. It may be Upton Sinclair's observation that a man has a tremendous capacity not to see a thing when his living depends upon his not seeing it. I'm sure if you're within that world, because of how it's funded, because of who supports a lot of their endeavors, conferences, academic efforts, you're gonna run afoul of a lot of those powerful factions if you speak out on this. So most people don't like to think of themselves as hypocrites. They will find a way to justify their hypocrisy in their self-interest. That's my theory from the outside. You're closer to these circles than I am. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, I think it's accurate. I think people are worried about ruining their careers and about creating enemies where they don't need enemies, and about hassle. My life will be a lot easier if I simply avoid, alienating certain people. And, if I'm the president of Columbia University and I'm looking at the political lay of the land, or Princeton University, I'm looking at the political lay of the land, I have to take into account that there are organized interests who are powerful and influential that I don't want to alienate. I think there's something else going on, and I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his address to the joint session of the U.S. Congress the other week, touched on this when he said, this is not a conflict between civilizations in the Samuel Huntington formulation. This is a conflict between civilization and barbarism. I think a lot of people, and they're not all Jewish, identify the Israeli cause with Western civilization, modernity.
Right. Yep.
I think that is a position susceptible to criticism because, as I've said, as is obviously true, we're not talking about liberalism playing itself out in Palestine, Israel. We're talking about ethnocentricity playing itself out at the level of a state government defined in terms of identitarian basis. That's exactly the opposite, or at least it's highly inconsistent with the ideals of liberal political theory, at least as they were taught to me when I was a college student at Northwestern University reading all these books. This is not what liberalism is. Liberalism is not a chosen people. That's a lot of things, and you can try to defend them, but it's not liberalism. And yet people identify, because of the close symbiotic connection between Israeli society and the United States and other Western societies, they identify the settler colonialists with the Western enterprise, and we are faced against a barbarous, ignorant, insane religious zealotry of radical Islam, and we had better choose sides and better choose sides quickly. I think that's part of what's going on too. They're choosing sides with what they think of as us.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you sound just like us now. So let me ask you, what is your least favorite dead white man to read? Which dead white men have you stopped reading? You still read Shakespeare? Well, I want to see if you're truly one of us.
I've read a lot of Shakespeare. I was blessed with a
all
good.
Right, so then you're still all right. So you're still hooked on the dead white men then. All right, maybe I spoke too soon. No, I'm kidding, of course. I'm joking. No, you sound just like us. It is, I remember the viral confrontation between Sam Harris and Ben Affleck on the Bill Maher show when Sam Harris started talking about Islamic doctrine. He started criticizing Islamic doctrine, and Ben Affleck butts in, well, this is racist. And they said, no, it's not. No, it's not. And I admit at the time, I kind of took Harris and Maher's side. I'm like, no, they're making good faith critiques of Muslim doctrine. These are religious ideas that they don't actually mean this as criticisms of Muslims as people or as license to abuse, or in this case, mass murder Muslims as people. They're just criticizing ideas. But what this has exposed is that no, underneath that veil of, well, we're just talking ideas here, we're just debating here, there is actually a pretty bone deep contempt for Islamic civilization as being oppositional to Western civilization. Now, if you want to litigate those ideas, you can litigate those ideas in good faith. You cannot assume that what you feel is a certain Western superiority that you latch onto in your defense of Israel gives you a license to kill. And when your attachment to Western civilization fills you with the sense that you have a license to kill people, to mass murder people, because their values are not the same as yours, which is the first card they played after October 7th. Well, try being gay in Gaza. That's neither here nor there, whether you could be gay in Gaza. Doesn't give it just because they don't tolerate certain norms that you are attached to as a Western liberal. That does not give you the right to go and do with them as you please. In this case, ethnically purge their land, killing tens of thousands of them. And I think you touched on that. This is racism. Russell wrote a whole article talking about how a lot of these social justice ideas that a lot of these students were taught are now being put into practice post October 7th. And the people who taught them to those students are saying, whoa, what are you doing? Well, what are we doing? We're putting into practice the ideas that you put in our head, except you didn't really mean them ever, did you?
Yeah, I describe it as a Frankenstein project.
Yes.
They stitch together a little bit of dialectical materialism, some postmodernism, and some colonial theory. And my left perspective on this is that they carefully constructed a completely ineffectual left with no class consciousness and no material analysis. and they never expected that monster to turn on them. And then October 7th, all of a sudden, all of these ideas that they had conveyed to them came into practice, and they had no idea what to do. It was very much the monster turning on its creator. I think that what's called woke today is the end product of a decades-long effort to create a left that would have the posture of rebelliousness without the substance and without any real critique of power. I always tell them if they put it on the side of a Starbucks cup, it's not a threat to anybody.
So basically, a diluted left, a watered down left.
Well, that's what they thought they had. That's why, in my opinion, that's why they're so obsessed with litigating the past. That's why they want to litigate slavery in the past. We have slavery now. You don't see them advocating that people get involved. That'll mess with supply chains. That'll mess with current interests. That'll mess with big corporations. They want people endlessly navel gazing about historical wrongs that can no longer be corrected. Yes, some of the after effects of them can be corrected. I think that should be done, but I don't think that's the intention. The intention is to keep people fighting over things that will not impact power in any meaningful way because they're not current. If they really cared, they'd say, look, we have human trafficking all over the world. They don't say that. They don't say that. They don't encourage people to take that righteous anger. You see how terrible that was? Well, it's happening now. So do this. Never. That's not the intention.
In other words, they don't have a real politics.
No.
A politics of the mobilization of people, of the education of people to understand their interests in a deep way, and then of their organization of people in an effective way to be able to move the needle on the structures in which we are all embedded. They have a faux politics. They have a pretend politics. That would be my way of putting it.
Please clap.